Hi, my name's Heather Dawe and welcome to the Little Peak podcast. This is an occasional podcast where we discuss a book with their writer. Some of the books will be published by Little Peak, others will not, and we're mixing it up a little. This time, I'm delighted to say I'm talking with Katie Ives about her first book, Imaginary Peaks, published in October 2021 by Mountaineers Books. Welcome, Katie. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you too.
A graduate of Harvard and the Iowa Writers' Workshop, Katie is one of the most well-read living scholars of mountaineering history and mountain culture. In her role as editor-in-chief at Alpinist, she was known for the quality of her editorial standards and the ways she worked with the magazine's contributors to help them with the crafting of their writing. Imaginary Peaks is Katie's first book, and I'm really excited to be discussing with her today. So I'll go into I've got some questions, Katie, and you're going to do a couple of readings and things, which will be great. So first question, Rich, to begin with, can you tell me about Imaginary Peaks and what your motivations were for writing it, please?
Oh, well, do you want me to start with just sort of a summary of what the book is about, or
yeah, that would be great. An overview and your motivations.
Yeah, so Imaginary Peaks started out for me with a couple of paragraphs that I read in Andy Selter's classic book on North American climbing history called Ways to the Sky. And in it, he described this extraordinary mountaineering hoax that took place in 1962 when readers of Summit magazine opened the pages to see this photo of this very surreal looking rock range with these giant spires rising above glaciers and these menacing clouds looming above. And accompanying the photo, there was an article written by an anonymous author describing these peaks as the alleged Riesenstein peaks of British Columbia, saying that they'd never been found before, and that a group of Austrian climbers had stumbled upon them, bushwhacked in, attempted some of the summits, got to the top of lower peaks, but hadn't managed to climb the highest one because they'd been turned back by avalanche and storm. But perhaps somebody could return and they could overcome the final crux if they're willing to place a couple bolts. And alongside the article, there was also a map of the area, and it claimed that this area was between the Kluwati and the Skeena rivers, and it claimed it was, there's these huge block letters saying unexplored. So, here was this idea about this, hitherto undiscovered mountain range in British Columbia in 1962 that somehow missed all of the efforts of modern map makers. And the peaks were really appealing. This was the early 1960s. It was around the time that big wall climbing was taking off in Yosemite, and Yosemite climbers were starting to think about taking those skills to the greater granite ranges of the world, as Yvon Chouinard would talk about in his manifesto on Yosemite climbing, which would be published a year after the hoax. So the time was right for people to really be drawn in by this image. And indeed, many American climbers saw this and immediately wanted to find the peaks, and they started writing to their Canadian friends. They started looking at Canadian maps, and it turned out that no such peaks existed in British Columbia. There were mountains in that particular area, but they were shaped differently than the Riesenstein. They were just a different set of peaks. So it took a few years for people to figure out where the peaks actually were, because of course these were photos of real mountains. And finally in 1965, around 1965, two groups of American climbers figured out independently of each other that these peaks were actually the Kachatna Peaks of Alaska. And that area was in fact well known. It was known to indigenous people, it was known to white explorers going back to the 1890s, but no climbers had been there. As far as anybody knew, nobody had climbed any of the summits. So that was how the hoaxers had been able to get away with presenting this as an unknown area. So after that, the first expedition to climb the mountains set off in 1965. I read this and I thought, well, what a fantastic story. It's imagining mountains in the 1960s. This is a time when we would have thought that, these things couldn't happen anymore, but, they could, as it turns out. And so I wanted to know more about it. And, at the time, there were three men who had been involved in creating the hoax, Austin Post, Edward LaChapelle and Harvey Manning. And at the time that I started researching it in 2011, Austin Post was still alive, although LaChapelle and Manning had both passed away. So I reached out to Austin and I asked him about it, and he was like, "Oh, the Riesenstein hoax is alive and well. That's great to hear." So we exchanged, some short correspondence, but I didn't realize that he wasn't well. And shortly after, not that long after our correspondence, he too passed away. So there were many more questions that I had that I wasn't able to ask of him. And the story stuck in my mind for a number of years. And finally, I kind of realized I needed to write a book about it, that, I needed to learn more about the story behind the hoax, but I also needed to learn more about why so many people, including myself, were drawn to the idea of imaginary mountains, before the hoax, after the hoax, because it seemed like a much larger issue and part of a much larger history than just this one amusing anecdote.
Sure.
So that's how it all began.
Okay. That's fascinating. So the hoax and its main and the main protagonist, Harvey Manning, sort of springboards you into exploring throughout the book, really, the many ways mountains have fired the human imagination through, much further back than the 1960s, when Manning and his protagonists came up with the hoax. I suppose it's to think that it actually happened in the 1960s, like you say, when you'd assume that these kind of things couldn't happen. I was reading a while ago about fact checking. I was reading an essay by John McPhee when he was talking about the importance of fact checking in magazines and journals. And I know I've experienced that the strength and the weight that Alpinist use in terms of fact checking is very thorough. So do you think Harvey Manning was like a fact checker's worst nightmare?
Yeah, I mean, fact checking was different, of course, in the early 1960s. They didn't have satellite imagery, they didn't have Google Earth. There were, in fact, parts of maps of the coast mountains of British Columbia where the Riesenstein was alleged to exist that did have blank spaces in them. So a lot of times I think editors did have to rely more on the word of the author turning in an article than we would now. So in some ways it was easier to get away with something like that. But yeah, I mean, certainly as a magazine editor myself, I definitely have and continue to have an intense fascination with the history of fact checking. It was something that I learned early on that, there are different ways that we make errors today. I mean, the internet, it's very easy for misinformation to spread and become entrenched as truth, because all it takes is one person to rely on, and, if somebody mistranscribes a date in an article, and then other people write articles about the same thing and they use the mistranscribed date from the original source, and all of a sudden that fact is entrenched in history. And that was something that Harvey Manning talked about himself, in the days before the internet, looking at, printed books, sort of similar ways that errors or false claims or exaggerations become a part of history through the dint of, editors not thoroughly checking them, and then those errors getting repeated again and again by multiple sources until it seems like absolutely, well, you read it in 5 sources, it must be true, and you don't realize that they all date back to the original erroneous. To the original error. So, Harvey talked about, for him, the inspiration of the bathtub hoax during World War I, which was done by a writer named Mencken, who created this sort of elaborate fake history of the invention of the bathtub and passed it off as real, really intending it just as kind of a humorous satire, only to find, to his surprise, that no matter how many times he told people it was a hoax, historians kept repeating it, decades afterwards. And that kind of made him aware, and then Harvey aware later, reading about this history, of just how easy it is for folklore to kind of make that transition into reality. And I think for me, it was sort of amusing as well to sort of read Harvey writing about this stuff very self-consciously, and saying, at one point, one of his articles, he says, I freely admit to mixing fact and fiction. And, one of my goals is to test the mettle of future historians. And, here I am, like a future historian, reading it and feeling a bit tested.
No, it's fascinating.
But also delighted, that I had these that he'd left these kind of puzzles and riddles for us to solve.
Yeah, and I've been reading reading folklore recently, British folklore, Welsh and Scottish in particular, and linking that through and sort of looking at names of climbing routes, and in the Pembrokeshire Sea Cliffs, for example, then the way they link in to folklore, there's a link there, isn't there? That I think it does fire the imagination. And so you can understand why. Well, I can understand. I'm sure you can. Why you must. Yeah, why Manning was so fascinated with that kind of mix of fact and fiction. Yeah. So yeah. Thank you. So just sort of given alluded, back in the day, sort of 1960s. Yeah, not everywhere was mapped and climbed, but nowadays, pretty much everywhere on the planet, probably everywhere, maybe well close to, is mapped. A lot more areas have been climbed. Do you think a hoax on the Manning scale could happen again? Maybe it'll be on a smaller scale, but do you think it could happen again these days?
Well, I had a long discussion about this with 3 experts. I talked to Harish Kapadia, who's a well-known Indian explorer who's been to a lot of places that other people haven't been in the Karakoram. And I talked to Steve Svensson, who's an American mountaineer who's also an expert in that area. And I also talked to John Hessler, who's a cartographer and mountaineer at the Library of Congress. And I reached out, I asked them, well, is it possible in some area, like, near the disputed borders in the Karakoram between India and Pakistan, where foreigners aren't allowed to climb, where there aren't a lot of available photos, could somebody pass off an imaginary mountain there? And they all agreed that an imaginary mountain itself would not ultimately be possible because satellite imagery would take care of that. But they said it's possible that a hoax could last for a little while, at least, if it were on a lower mountain and if it were in one of those sort of sensitive border areas, and if it were simply a hoax about a wall, or a great cliff. Sure. Because that might not necessarily be so easy to distinguish by satellite photography. But however, as they pointed out, in the modern age, people do expect extensive documentation. So, with Harvey Manning, with his hoaxes, he presented just a photo of the alleged peak, with some route lines drawn on it and a map to accompany it, but he didn't include any climbing photos. And it's like nowadays we all expect climbing photos, climbing videos, yeah. Blogs, whatever, social media posts. Like there's an expectation of much more significant documentation with a sense. That said, of course, yes, people can fake that kind of documentation, and with modern technology and the rise of deep fakes, it might become easier to make a fake climb look real. But, and this was with something else the 3 of them agreed, you could get this past, say, like a magazine editor, a newspaper editor who wasn't doing significant amount of investigative research into every single first ascent claim that got sent to them. And the reality is most of us aren't, because, it's like you have a limited amount of time. You tend to take people's word for it, especially if it's a well-known climber. But, a regional expert would immediately recognize it as false. If you did a hoax like this, say in a part of the Karakoram where Harish Kapadia had been, he would immediately recognize it as false. And it's sort of in a similar way with one of Harvey Manning's hoaxes that he did he created an imaginary peak called No Name Peak in the Cascades, which was actually a photo of Mock's peaks, which he transformed to a different location, and he presented an image of it, some route lines drawn on it. And within a month, one of the regional experts there, D. Molinar, had recognized that as actually Mock's peaks. And he was like, I don't understand how these guys got so confused. Like, that's Mock's peak. That's nowhere near where they said it was. So, there's always going to be that like on the ground local climber who's going to be able to say, like, this is just completely made up.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's somewhat less likely these days, but like you say, with technology, well, it would last for a while, but then it can get disputed. Moving on, do you think you could read from Imaginary Peaks for us, please?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so you had asked about hoaxes, and I was going to start with one of Harvey Manning's earlier hoaxes, when I began researching the book, I got in touch with Dale Cole, who had not been involved in the Riesenstein hoax, but he had been involved in a series of earlier hoaxes that Harvey had done. And he told me that Harvey had designed these sort of multiple hoaxes in addition to the Riesenstein as a way to convey messages about the direction that he felt the mountaineering world was headed. And in order to decipher those messages, I'd need to understand Harvey's inspirations, hopes, and fears about climbing. So I'm going to read a section of the chapter they wrote on the sleeping system hoax, which was one of Harvey's first hoaxes. And, as you'll see, he considered it practice for bigger and better things. So to understand Harvey and his hoaxes, Dale Cole told me, people need to understand the burgeoning outdoors industry at the cusp of the 1960s. And Dale wrote, we saw the climbing culture itself change. New manufacturers moved into the scene, and they were selling their materials for prices that we thought were cruel and high. There was another breed of climber who took climbing far more seriously. Not that we didn't do serious climbing, but it wasn't a question of bragging about it in an arrogant way. Well, Harvey was particularly put out by this kind of climber, especially their accounts of accomplishments in climbing journals and magazines, depictions that made an ascent more of an ego trip than a climbing trip. As you well know, climbing dates and climbing facts and bragging rights and exaggerations come up in articles submitted to climbing magazines and misrepresent what's really there. Harvey himself said, facts and fiction read the very same way in print. On August 1st, 1959, Harvey wrote to his friend Ted Beck, detailing plans for his first known prank on the gear industry. Incidentally, I'll be calling on you shortly to take a proper part in the great hoax. While down at the REI co-op in June, I picked up a copy of Summit magazine, and the thing irritated me, especially all the pseudo-scholarly crap about sleeping bag research. So I wrote a long, circumstantial letter to the editor, describing a research project being carried on by the Cougar Mountaineers, of which I, H. Hawthorne Manning, am president. Dale Cole is going to follow up with some correct and further research as chairman of the Sleeping System Committee. Ideally, we hope dullards from all over the country are taken in and start criticizing the system. We can then answer them, having the tremendous advantage that we can invent all the necessary research and statistics, while they will be dependent on fact. Actually, this is proposed merely as a test. The experience should prove useful for a later hoax, unplanned, involving the American Alpine Club. Maybe we could discover a new climbing area in the Cascades, the Crazy Creek Crags. Crazy Creek is a third tributary on the left of the blank river. This has to be a real river. We would need a real climbing party, like Becky, Manning, and Cole. Stand ready to take action, but keep it quiet, since only about 4 people are in on the thing. It's a very promising lead. Might be possible in the long run to destroy the whole sport of climbing. Yours for mutual self-destruction, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Thank you very much. That's you get a real sense of his imagination, sense of humour in that reading. Thank you. Moving on, because you kind of, as I've said, you use the Riesenstein hoax and Harvey Manning, his protagonist, to sort of springboard into other areas of exploring the way mountains have inspired people to think creatively. I mean, I love the thinking and the creative space that reading Imaginary Peaks took my own head to, and by this I mean your book shows in many different ways how mountains have inspired people, and that's spiritually as much as physically. So as climbers, we're used to, we're inspired to climb mountains, to scale crags and summit peaks, but there's much more to mountains than that. I just wanted to ask you, what's more important to you, the climbing or the inspiration?
Well, I don't think you can separate the two. I think and I think that for many climbers, you can't even really say which comes first. It's climbing, as a lot of people said, is really an act of imagination. You're dreaming about a route, you're dreaming over a map, you're dreaming about a future adventure. And then you go out and you try to turn it into reality. And that experience of transforming imagination into reality is something that people have written about again and again as being really core to their enjoyment of mountaineering. Eric Shipton, the British explorer, wrote a famous passage where he talked about his love of sort of spending hours gazing at maps and coming up with dream expeditions that might or might not ever take place. And, you know, how for him, that sort of the dream was sort of almost even more important, that it was such a powerful experience that, you know, it didn't matter if he didn't actually get to all of those places. You know, I'm not sure if he was actually being honest with himself there. And I think for a lot of climbers, you know, we need that tangible experience. You know, we want to feel the rock in our hands, under our hands. We want to see the patterns and the colors of the ice. We want to have the adventure of moving upward, the solidarity with our friends, and the experience of kind of being able to live out, to create our own story through these experiences. So yeah, I think it's kind of part of the same thing. And, you know, kind of going beyond, of course, the sport of mountaineering, I mean, mountains have inherently attracted dreams of so many people across so many cultures around the world. You know, they've again and again, they're presented as a bridge between the earth and the heavens. And, you know, I remember one mountaineering scholar, PD, talking about how the very definition of a mountain is determined by the role that it plays in the cultural imagination of people who live near it. You know, sometimes people will talk about, you know, tiny little hills, they'll call them mountains. And it's like, they are mountains because they play an important role for the people who live near their base. You know, they've played a role in their dreams and their mythologies and their legends and their histories. So they become elevated into mountains. So it's almost like the very definition of a mountain is something that attracts this sort of work of the imagination.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's fascinating, isn't it? And I live at the bottom. I live in Yorkshire, in the UK, at the bottom of a hill called the Chevin, and it's not a mountain by any stretch of the imagination. It's got some good grit crags on it, which is great. But it's, to the people in the town I live in, Otley, it's a really important thing. The Otley Chevin is you know, it's somewhere we go to relax and to run around, walk around, whatever, and it's really part of our town's culture. And that, you know, you can stretch that out to other places. I spent a lot of time this year reading about Nanda Devi in the Himalaya, and the culture around that mountain is just amazing and extensive and fascinating. And like you said, and that was the thing. I mean, that was one of the things really reading Imaginary Peaks, the way it got me to think about all these different things. And I really appreciated that. So thank you. So moving on to my next question, you're renowned as someone who goes deeply into your research subject, and it's reflected throughout Imaginary Peaks. Is the research and writing one and the same for you?
I vastly prefer writing to doing research. I think I get stressed out when I'm researching because I start to think like, oh, what if I never finish this and I never start to write? And also, I think for me, the act of writing too, it's so close. The enjoyment I get from it is so similar to the enjoyment I get from climbing, you know, that sense of kind of losing oneself in a rhythm, like the rhythm of breaths or the rhythm of footsteps or the rhythm of swinging an ice axe. And so it's like the real joy comes from the storytelling and piecing it all together. Yeah. So, I mean, you know, obviously, if you are going to write about historical nonfiction, you do have to do a lot of research. It is important to be steeped in sort of the culture and the experiences and the biographies of the people involved. And, you know, as one writer once said at a writing conference I went to, that's like, you almost have to do 3 times as much research as you're actually going to use, because you want to be so absorbed in it that it starts to feel kind of natural.
Yeah.
To move through that world in your mind.
Completely. Okay. And sort of following on from that, so it often, most of the time, it's historical non-fiction for you, in such like. Have you, you know, are you tempted to explore other forms of fiction, of writing, like fiction, or for example?
Oh, I do. I mean, I've written personal essays that, you know, are just about my own experience. So there's no research, unless going for a climb is research,
Sure.
which it kind of is. Yeah, I got my MFA in fiction in 2004. So that was where I started out writing purely fiction and kind of moved into doing more nonfiction primarily for work, you know, occasionally for other magazines as well. But yeah, I mean, I have continued to work on fiction. I'm working on a novel, which I hope to publish one day.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I sort of think in a way, Imaginary Peaks was kind of practice for writing fiction, because I
Okay.
spent so much time studying other people's fictional worlds, and now I'm like, oh, maybe I'm ready to like actually commit to creating one myself.
Okay. It sounds very interesting. Thank you. So could you read again from Imaginary Peaks for us, please?
Oh, sure. So this is kind of a hodgepodge of different parts of the book, because I wanted to put together a more sort of coherent storyline. But one of the things that I found when I was researching the book is that these stories of imaginary peaks exist everywhere. And so this is one that existed in my own backyard. As a child growing up in the lowlands of eastern Massachusetts, I felt keenly the lack of high places in my backyard. And so perhaps my unconscious mind conjured a giant peak into being, its invisible contours rising out of the swells of drumlins and other traces of vanished ice age glaciers in the forest behind our home. In a recurring dream, I wandered deep into the ever-expanding woods until the hillside sharpened and I stood on the spine of a narrow ridge crest that arced into snow, seracs, and clouds. Many years later, I came across a journal entry by the philosopher Henry David Thoreau about a similar dream peak. Thoreau wrote in his journal from October 29, 1857, "There are some things of which I cannot at once tell whether I've dreamed them or they are real, as if they were just perchance establishing or else losing a real basis in my world. This is especially the case in the early morning hours, when there is a gradual transition from dreams to waking thoughts, from illusions to actualities, as from darkness or perchance moon and starlight to sunlight." Often, when Thoreau woke in his home in Concord, Massachusetts, the same vision receded from his mind. Asleep, he crossed the boundaries into an other world to the east of town, where dim wood fringed the base of a great mountain. Alone, he trembled as he scrambled up its stony crest, past the bent shapes of Krumholtz trees and the shadows of feral creatures. I lost myself quite in the upper air and clouds, he recalled, seeming to pass an imaginary line which separates a hill, mere earth heaped up, from a mountain, into a superterranean grandeur and sublimity. It can never become familiar. You are lost the moment you set foot there. You know no path, but wander, thrilled, over the bare and pathless rock, as if it were solidified air and cloud. The summit remained half hidden, a blocky silhouette in a shimmer of clouds. For a moment, Thoreau felt as if he'd been transported into an ethereal realm. Then the contours of the peak dissolved in the morning sky, like the facets of a giant ice crystal melting before the New England farms and the low hills. It is a promised land which I have not yet earned, he concluded. I grew up only a short walk from Thoreau's cabin. From my mother's house, I often descended through the dark hemlock groves, contoured the green-leaved shores of Flint's Pond, and hiked over the faint swell of Pine Hill. Ahead, summer crowds of tourists and pilgrims tramped beside Walden Pond, seeking communion with Thoreau's memory, while the sound of a commuter train echoed loon-like from the far side of the water. In those days, I thought of Walden as simply a place to swim. It wasn't until recently that I read Thoreau's writing in depth, and when I came across his October 29 journal entry, the familiar landmarks of my childhood, described in 19th century prose, stirred memories of August haze thick as maple syrup, of vistas hemmed by branches, of slopes too gentle and rocks too small for climbing. I remembered my own explorations of an imaginary summit near the same place. Dreams are real, Thoreau asserted, as is the light of the stars and moon. And when I finally read those words, I felt a sudden recognition. Near Concord, of course, that mountain exists. Night after night, I've attempted it too.
Thank you very much. That must be an amazing thing to read about, to read Thoreau and then have your own memories at the same time. Wow. So thank you. You've recently left Alpinist, a place that through the years you became synonymous with. I understand that's to pursue your own writing. Well,
the reason I left was that because of staffing cuts, my workload just became unsustainably high. But having left, what I am doing is my own writing, primarily working on a second book, this time about real mountains. So I've moved from imaginary mountains to real ones. And I'm also working on some personal essays, working on this novel that I'd really like to write, that does involve an imaginary mountain.
Okay.
And then also, to help pay the bills, I've agreed to edit 3 books, maybe some more. We'll see how much I have time for. So
Okay, so it sounds like you're still busy with the editing as well. That will, because I mean I worked with you once for Alpinist, and I really appreciated working with you, and I get the impression that that you really love engaging with the writers you work with on Alpinist. So it sounds like you're going to be keeping in touch with the editorial work and in that. Yeah, I do you think you're going to, well, I was going to ask if you'll miss it, but it sounds like you're keeping in touch through editorial work.
Yeah, I mean, I have all kinds of ideas for my future, when I actually finish the second book, which is, I mean, the book's going to be my primary focus for the next year or so. I have to turn in a rough draft currently, October 2023. So,
Okay.
but once that book is done, I've thought about all kinds of things. I've thought about starting my own magazine. I've thought about trying to relaunch one of the magazines that became defunct.
Sure.
And I do really enjoy the experience of magazine editing. I like the idea of collecting a wide range of voices and experiences and stories and presenting them all in one place. Really kind of creating a world in a way for readers to wander through and to encounter unexpected experiences and to have that, that sort of adventure of going from cover to cover. I think is a really powerful one. And it's particularly powerful as a means to amplify voices of people who haven't been well represented in climbing literature in the past. And that was really core to what I was doing at Alpinist and a huge part of my inspiration and very much something I want to keep up. I think it's incredibly important. I think, for a long time, mountaineering literature in the English language, of course, was particularly, it was largely dominated by white men and to a lesser extent white women. And this sort of increasing movement nowadays to open those gates to the increasing work of activists from communities of color, from communities that have from other communities that have been marginalized in the past, to really transform the genre, to make it more diverse, to make it more creative, to make it more experimental. It's a really exciting thing, and I really feel like this is one of the most exciting periods possible to be involved in mountain literature. And and definitely as an editor, you have that experience of not just focusing on your own voice, but focusing on helping other people find their voice and helping other people find a platform, on amplifying their voices. And that's something that's really important to me. And I definitely want to figure out a way to do that again in the future, whether it's as an editor or whether it's as a teacher or writing coach or, whatever role I can find to help people behind the scenes with their own writing, because that's really important to me.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to reading your future books. And also, seeing I'm sure where you end up working, and lots of different roles in the future. It'll be fascinating to see, and for those people who work with you as well. So, as a final question, can I ask you about your own climbing? How and where do you climb regularly?
Well, I just moved from Vermont to Colorado, so that's a question that's changed a bit. During the years that I was in Vermont, I was working really long hours at the magazines, so I didn't tend to travel that far. Did a lot close to home, and sometimes that meant driving for a couple hours to go climbing on one of the ice gullies on Mount Washington. Sometimes that meant driving up to Lake Willoughby, which was about an hour and 15 minutes away. A lot of time that just meant climbing in Smuggler's Notch, which was about 20 minutes from my house and about 10 minutes from the office, so really convenient. Did a lot of ice climbing there during the 13 years that I lived in Vermont. And particularly, I often went at night because that was a way to avoid the crowds. And I also felt like, well, I can put in a full work day, ice climb for a few hours at night and then go back to my apartment and work a few more hours and, go to bed at midnight or whatever. But I really love that experience of being in the mountains. If you can call Vermont's mountains, they're little mountains.
Well, it's all relative, isn't it? I live in the UK, so
Yeah,
our
yeah.
mountains are quite small, but they're still mountains.
Yeah, being there after dark and with a
Yeah.
headlamp shining off the ice, you can see everything you need to see. Only it's a bit more mysterious because you can't really see the top out, so you don't really know
Yeah.
what the top of the cliff is going to be like. And you can't really see the void below you because it's just darkness. So that became a way of sort of experiencing a sense of more like mystery and wild and solitude, even though I was living in the American Northeast, which is has a relatively high population density. And yeah, now I've moved out to Colorado. I've moved from a small town in northern Vermont to a large metropolitan area, which is a bit overwhelming.
Okay.
I'm doing a lot more highway driving, which I haven't done in a long time. But I'm on the outskirts of Boulder, to the south, and I'm within walking distance of the climbing routes and the Flatiron. So I've been spending a lot of time there. And just really enjoying on some of the more obscure routes that feeling of just like, open air and solitude and, quiet, wild stone that you can still find on the outskirts of the city there. I made it out to El Dorado Canyon a couple times. Most recently, a couple days ago, we went to go to climb a route on Short-Tailed Peak, and it was just amazing. There'd been a blizzard just a few days ago, and we got out there and we thought like, oh, there's snow and ice all over everything. We're not going to be able to go rock climbing. We should have gone ice climbing instead. But it turned out the sun was just like blazing on the route that we went to go to, called Gambit, and yeah, so this is an amazing experience of moving over warm red gold stone, above these like deep blue shadows of snow below us and around us, and like looking out to the snow-covered peaks in the distance. And yeah,
sounds amazing. And
yeah,
there's lots more areas in Colorado to explore as well, no doubt. So
yeah,
keep you busy.
I'm definitely doing some ice climbing and trying to get into the park, Rocky Mountain National Park, and just kind of being in bigger mountains again, because it's been a long time.
Okay. Yeah. So, and do you have any particular climbing venues sort of around the world that you'd like to visit?
Oh yeah, I have so many. I don't even know where to start.
Okay.
I mean, I've dreamed of climbing in Norway. I've dreamed of New Zealand. I have been to the Canadian Rockies a few times, and I really want to go back there. There's something about that place that just speaks to my imagination almost more than anywhere else I've been. It's just these deep green, endless forests and these like oddly shaped rock peaks and ice fields. So
I agree with that. I've been to, well, I know you've just recently come back from Banff. I've been to Banff a couple of times. I've spent some time bikepacking through the Canadian Rockies, and yeah, they're an amazing place. So I can understand that.
Yeah, I want to spend more time in the North Cascades. Definitely writing this book that, so much of it took place in the Cascades made me realize just like what an incredibly beautiful and wild place it is, and how immense it is. And, you could spend a lifetime wandering the valleys as well as the mountains, as Harvey did, and still not see it all.
Well, they all sound fantastic. I dream about the American West. I haven't spent very much time in there, but mainly bikepacking, not climbing. But yeah, I'll be back to explore some more at some point.
Yeah, let me know. We'll go climbing together.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be fantastic. I think that, well, those are the end of my questions. Thank you very much indeed. I was meant to show Katie's book to start with. Katie, so Imaginary Peaks, more than recommend reading this book. It's fantastic. In the UK, it's available on the Little Peak website. And at the moment, Katie was very kind to send over some signed book plates. So copies are going out with signed book plates if you get in quick enough. In North America, it's available in bookstores and online. And yeah, like I say, I heartily recommend it. So Katie, thank you so much for your time and for talking to me today. It's been really brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I'm looking forward to reading your work, because I know that you've got some exciting projects.
Yeah, I've been working on short stories recently. I think I worked on one with you, which was great, and I've got another one coming out in Alpinist next edition, which is blending folklore and climbing and and my own experiences. So yeah, in that, but you know, be quite open about it. Imaginary Peaks really helped me to sort of imagine these things and these stories. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, when your book comes out, we should do this again. We should talk about your book next